The receipt is still in my wallet. Folded twice, soft at the creases like cloth. $3,814,226.11. The final draw on the construction account, dated 14 months before the first confirmed case in Bakersfield. I keep it because it reminds me of the man I was, and because that man deserves to be remembered accurately. Not fondly, accurately. My name is Craig Lefferts. I was 46 when I broke ground on the shelter, 47 when it was finished, and 48 when I learned. Standing in the most expensive room I'd ever built, in the most expensive building I'd ever owned, surrounded by people I hadn't invited. That ownership is a temperature. It rises, it falls, and eventually it reaches a point where it doesn't measure anything real. I made my money in commercial roofing. Not glamorous, not tech. I owned the largest flat roof membrane company in the Central Valley of California, Lefferts Pacific Coatings. And for 22 years I put thermoplastic polyolefin on warehouses, distribution centers, cold storage facilities, and strip malls from Stockton to Bakersfield. Peak year, we cleared $9 million net on $41 million gross. I drove a white F350 with my company name on the door, not because I needed to advertise, but because I wanted everyone on the 99 to know whose truck that was. That's the kind of man I was. The kind who needs the name on the door. The shelter was my idea, not a bunker. I hated that word. A bunker is a hole in the ground with a steel door and canned beans. What I built was a 4-level underground residence, 8,300 square feet total, on a 40-acre parcel outside Porterville, California, in the Sierra foothills east of the Tule River. Elevation 1,140 feet. Granite substrate under 18 inches of topsoil. I paid a geological survey team $11,000 to confirm what I already believed, which is that God put that particular hill there specifically for me. Level 1 was entry and decontamination, air filtration, blast-rated door manufactured by a company in Idaho that usually sold to the Department of Defense. $212,000 for that door alone. I had the invoice framed and hung in the entry corridor. People think that's a joke. It isn't. I framed it because I wanted every person who walked through to understand what it cost to keep them safe, and therefore what they owed the man who paid for it. Level 2 was operations and living quarters, kitchen with a commercial 6-burner range I'd seen in a restaurant supply catalog. A garland, $14,800. Walk-in pantry stocked to feed 6 adults for 18 months. Water from a well drilled to 340 feet, with a hand pump backup and a 3,000-gallon cistern. Diesel generator rated for 12 kilowatts continuous, with 1,800 gallons of treated fuel in a buried tank. I could run that generator 16 hours a day for 8 months. I knew that number the way other men know their blood pressure. Level 3 was storage and armory. Weapons. I am not going to itemize because that's not this story. Medical supplies purchased in bulk from a veterinary wholesaler in Fresno who didn't ask questions. 72 bins of freeze-dried meals. 16 cases of bourbon because I was honest enough to admit that surviving the apocalypse sober was a form of cruelty I wouldn't inflict on myself. Level 4 was mine. The bottom, deepest point. 41 feet below grade. A private suite with a king bed, real hardwood floors, white oak, $22 per square foot installed. A wet bar. A gun safe. A 75-inch screen connected to exterior cameras. And a leather chair I'd had custom built in North Carolina. The chair cost $6,400. It was the most comfortable object I've ever owned. And I sat in it exactly 11 times before a woman named Janelle Okafor Park sat in it without asking, and I realized it wasn't mine anymore. I'm telling you the prices because the prices are how I understood things. I measured the shelter in dollars the way a surveyor measures land in feet. Every object had a value. Every value had an owner. And the owner was me. That stopped being true on day 3. I drove to the shelter on day 1. Not because I was prescient, because I'd been rehearsing this drive for 3 years. The news out of Bakersfield was confused, but the vectors were clear enough if you'd spent as much time as I had reading preparedness forums and CDC advisories, neurological pathology, rapid behavioral change, biting. The word zombie wasn't on any official channel yet, but every prepper board I followed had already said it 40 times before lunch. I left my house in Northwest Visalia at 7:40 a.m. with a pre-packed duffel in the truck bed and my wallet in my back pocket. Didn't call my ex-wife. Didn't call my daughter, who was 23 and living in Portland. Didn't call my foreman or my office manager or any of the 114 employees of Lefferts Pacific Coatings. I called nobody because the shelter was designed for Craig Lefferts, and Craig Lefferts traveled alone. The drive to Porterville took 41 minutes. The drive from the Porterville turnoff to the property took another 19, on a gravel road that I had resurfaced the previous spring at a cost of $34,000. I unlocked the surface gate. I drove through. I locked it behind me. I parked in the camouflaged vehicle bay, which was a poured concrete garage built to look like a hay barn from the air, $87,000 including the false roof. I walked to the blast door. I entered the 16-digit code. I heard the bolts disengage. I stepped inside. And then I stood in my decontamination corridor, under lights I'd paid for, breathing air filtered through a system I'd spec'd. And I felt the thing I'd been chasing for 3 years. Not safety, possession. The shelter was mine, the crisis was real. And every dollar I'd spent was now retroactively justified. I want to be honest about that feeling because it matters for what came later. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't grieving. I was gratified. The men in the online forums who'd called me paranoid, the ex-wife who'd cited the shelter as evidence of instability in the divorce filing, the financial advisor who'd urged me to put the money into index funds. They were all wrong. And I was right. And the concrete walls around me were the proof. I spent day 1 running system checks. Generator, online, water, pressurized, air, cycling, cameras, clear on all 4 exterior angles. I opened a bottle of 21-year-old Redbreast, poured 3 fingers into a crystal glass I'd bought at an estate sale for $90, and I sat in my $6,400 chair on level 4 and watched my cameras show an empty hilltop under a blue California sky. Day 2, the cameras showed something different. A Tulare County Sheriff's cruiser parked at my gate at 6:15 a.m. 2 deputies. They spoke into a radio and drove away. At 11:40 a.m., a convoy appeared on the gravel road. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans and a flatbed truck carrying equipment I couldn't identify from the camera angle. They stopped at the gate. A man in a navy blue windbreaker got out and began examining the lock. I watched this from level 4, glass of water in hand. I'd switched from bourbon. It was still morning. And I felt the second feeling, the one that came after possession. Indignation. This was mine. Every bolt, every watt, every filtered cubic foot of air. I had the invoices. I had the deed. I had the construction permit signed by Tulare County itself. And now Tulare County, or whoever these people represented, was standing at my gate. They cut the lock at 1:17 p.m. I watched them do it on a camera that cost $2,200. They drove to the vehicle bay. They found the blast door, and the man in the navy windbreaker taped a piece of paper to it. I walked up 3 flights of stairs, through my operations level, past my kitchen, through my decontamination corridor, and I opened the inner viewport. A 6-inch square ballistic glass window set into the door at eye level, another $4,100, and I read the document taped to the exterior. Emergency Requisition Order, issued under California Government Code Section 8572. Authority of the Governor. The state of California was exercising eminent domain over the structure, its contents, and the surrounding 40 acres, effective immediately. compensation to be determined at a future date. They wanted my shelter. I pressed the intercom button. The speaker outside was a marine-grade unit, rated to 115 decibels, and I'd tested it once at full volume just to hear my own voice projected that loud. "This is private property," I said. "I am the owner. You are trespassing." The man in the windbreaker looked at the intercom grill with the expression of someone who has rehearsed patience but not yet needed it. "Mr. Lefferts," he said, "my name is Dale Renton. I'm with the California Office of Emergency Services. We've been directed to secure this facility for public use. Can we discuss this face-to-face?" "No," I said. "You can discuss it with my attorney." There was a pause that I enjoyed enormously. "Mr. Lefferts, the cellular network in Tulare County went down 40 minutes ago. I don't think your attorney is available." Dale Renton was 51, lean, sunburnt across the nose, and he wore the windbreaker like a costume he'd been handed that morning. The 9 people with him included 2 actual OES field staff, 3 National Guard reservists in mismatched fatigues, and 4 Tulare County emergency workers who had the specific facial tension of people told to do something they don't believe they have the authority to do. I didn't learn any of this until later. On day 2, they were just shapes on my cameras. 10 people standing around my blast door like tourists at a monument, reading the seizure order I refused to acknowledge. They camped. They had 2 dome tents and an OES emergency supplies trailer that they parked near the vehicle bay. I watched them set up a portable generator, a Honda EU2200i, which I recognized because I'd considered buying the same unit as a backup before deciding it was underpowered for serious use. Retail $1,149. I remember thinking, they brought a $1,000 generator to take my $4 million shelter. The disproportion pleased me. I should tell you what was happening in the world during this time, to the extent I knew. My shelter had a shortwave radio and a commercial scanner. By the evening of day 2, most FM stations in the valley were either off the air or looping automated emergency broadcasts. The scanner picked up fragments of law enforcement and National Guard traffic that suggested a defensive perimeter had been attempted around Fresno and had failed. The word infected appeared in every 3rd transmission. The word overrun appeared in every 5th. I logged these in a notebook I kept on level 2, a moleskin, $19.95, which I note because I had purchased 12 of them specifically for record keeping during a crisis, and the act of writing in one gave me the same satisfaction as watching the numbers in my construction account go down. Everything was cost. Everything was mine. On the morning of day 3, Dale Renton pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Lefferts, we have information about conditions to the west that I think you'd want to hear. Can we talk?" "You can talk from there," I said. "I can hear you fine." Salia is gone. The infection spread through the hospital system first, then through the shelters that were set up at the fairgrounds. The guard pulled out last night. Everything between the 99 and the foothills is. The word we're using is uncontained. My team was supposed to report to a staging area in Springville, but as of 400 this morning, Springville is not responding. I listened. I said nothing. "The reason we're here, Mr. Lefferts, is that this facility appears on a county infrastructure survey from 2022. Your building permits were flagged when OES started identifying potential hardened structures in the region. You built something that works, and right now there are approximately 400 people in the Porterville area who have nowhere to go. This shelter holds 6, I said. The order isn't asking you to house 400 people. It's asking you to transfer control of this facility to the state so that it can be used as a command and communication node." "Command and communication node?" I repeated. "Yes. For a state government that can't answer its own radio." Another pause. This one I did not enjoy as much. "Mr. Lefferts, I'm authorized to enter this facility. The order is legal. If you refuse, I'm further authorized to… To what, Dale? Blow the door? That's a level 7 blast door rated to withstand 1,200 pounds of TNT equivalent overpressure. You brought a Honda generator and 2 dome tents. You're authorized to sit outside and wait. I released the intercom button. On my camera, I watched Dale Renton stand very still, then take off his windbreaker and fold it over his arm, and then walk back to his tent. He moved like a man whose day has gotten longer than he planned. I went back down to level 4. I sat in my chair. I opened my notebook. I wrote the date, the time, and a single line. They want my shelter. They can't have it. I underlined it twice. What I have not told you yet is that the shelter was not empty when I arrived. I had a guest. Uninvited, but present by a decision I'd made 6 weeks earlier that I now considered the single worst judgment of my adult life. Worse than the marriage and roughly equivalent to the divorce. Her name was Janelle Okafor Park. She was 39, a former project manager at a Bay Area biotech firm, and she was in my shelter because I had been sleeping with her for 4 months and had given her the entry code during a moment of post-coital idiocy that I can only attribute to the fact that she laughed at things I said as though they were genuinely funny. Janelle arrived on day 1 at approximately 2 p.m., 6 hours after me. She came in through the blast door while I was on level 3 inventorying ammunition, and I heard her boots on the decontamination grating and knew before I climbed the stairs exactly who it was and exactly what it meant. She'd driven from San Jose, 8 hours, most of it on back roads after the 99 became impassable south of Merced. She had a backpack, a sleeping bag, a handgun I didn't know she owned. A Glock 43, which she carried with the casual competence of someone who'd grown up with weapons and simply hadn't mentioned it. And the 16-digit code that I had whispered to her in the dark of a hotel room in Cambria, as though it were an endearment. "You said I could come," she said. "I said a lot of things in Cambria. You said, if things go sideways, you come to Porterville and you punch in this code. That's what you said." She was right. I had said that. I had said it because at the time it made me feel powerful and generous, which are the same feeling when you have money and someone is looking at you with attention you believe you've purchased. Janelle was not the kind of woman who could be purchased, as it turned out. She was the kind of woman who would take you at your word when your word was convenient and then hold you to it when it wasn't. "The shelter is designed for 1, I said. "The shelter is designed for 6. You told me that too." "For my family?" "Craig, you don't have a family. You have an ex-wife in Clovis who won't answer your calls and a daughter in Portland who texts you on Father's Day. I'm what you have." She said it without cruelty. She said it the way she said most things, with a directness that I found alternately attractive and unbearable, depending on whether it was aimed at me. I let her stay. Not because I'd made peace with it, but because the alternative was physically removing a woman with a Glock from a shelter I couldn't lock her out of, since she already knew the code. There's a particular flavor of helplessness that comes from realizing your own security system has been compromised by your own loneliness. It tastes like copper and bourbon. So when the government arrived on day 2, I was already living with the first breach of my sovereignty. Janelle occupied level 2. She slept in one of the 4 bunks I'd installed. Each one $3,200, custom built on marine suspension frames, and she used my kitchen and my water and my electricity with the relaxed entitlement of someone who had been told she was welcome and intended to be. "Those people outside have a legal order," she said on the morning of day 3 after I'd finished my intercom exchange with Dale Renton. "It's not legal, it's extortion with a letterhead. Craig, there are people dying in Porterville right now. There are always people dying somewhere. That's not my problem." She looked at me across the granite countertop. $14,200 Cambria quartz, color charcoal mist. And her expression contained something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, measurement. She was pricing me the way I priced everything else, and arriving at a figure. "It's your problem if you want to be a person when this is over," she said. "It's not your problem if you're fine being a receipt." She went downstairs. I heard her boots on the metal staircase, each step ringing against the $38,000 worth of powder-coated steel I'd had fabricated in Bakersfield. I stood alone in my kitchen and I was furious, and the fury had the specific character of a man who suspects he's been appraised correctly. On the evening of day 3, I watched something on the cameras that changed the geometry. The 10 people at my gate had become 14. 4 civilians had walked up the gravel road. 2 women, a man, and a teenager. And Dale Renton's team had taken them in. I could see the new arrivals sitting on folding chairs near the OES trailer, eating something from foil pouches. One of the women had blood on her shirt. The teenager was holding his arm at an angle that suggested a fracture someone had splinted with a piece of wood and electrical tape. And then, at the perimeter of the camera's range, maybe 400 yards down the road, I saw movement in the scrub oaks that wasn't wind and wasn't animal. 3 figures, moving in the staggered, arrhythmic gait that every news broadcast had been trying to describe for 72 hours. The footage I'd seen online made them look almost comical. Stumbling, slack-jawed, predictable. On my camera, in the golden late afternoon light of the foothills, they looked like people who had been emptied of everything except forward motion. They came through the scrub in silence. They didn't seem to see the camp. They crossed the road 200 yards south of the gate and disappeared into the oaks on the other side, heading east. Dale Renton saw them too. I watched him stand, watched them pass, and then turn to look directly at my camera. He knew I was watching. He didn't press the intercom. He just looked at the lens for a long 5 seconds, and then he went back to his tent. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my king bed on level 4, 41 feet underground, temperature controlled at 68 degrees, air cycling through HEPA filters that cost $900 each. And I stared at the ceiling I'd had finished with acoustic tile. $31 per square foot. And I listened to the silence of my own shelter. Janelle was 2 floors above me. The government was 50 feet above that. The infected were somewhere in the oaks. And I was at the bottom of a hole I'd spent $3.8 million digging, and I realized that what I'd actually purchased was the ability to lie in the dark and know exactly how much the dark had cost. Day 4. Dawn. I was on level 2 making coffee. A Technivore Mocha Master, $349, and the one luxury item I'll defend to the grave. When Janelle came up from level 3, where she'd been doing an inventory I hadn't asked her to do. "You're short on antibiotics," she said. "I have a full medical kit." "You have a full kit for 1 person for 18 months. You have 2 people, that cuts it to 9 months. And the kid up there with the broken arm is going to develop an infection within 48 hours if someone doesn't clean and reset that fracture properly. The kid is not my responsibility. The kid is 14 years old and his name is Marco, and I talked to his mother on the intercom for 20 minutes last night while you were in your chair." "You used my intercom?" "I used the intercom in the shelter I'm living in, yes." I set my coffee down. The mug was a plain white ceramic I'd bought in bulk, 12 for $36, because even in my shelter I could not bring myself to drink from anything that looked cheap. "Janelle, if I open that door, I lose the shelter." "You don't lose it. You share it. Sharing it is losing it. If 10 people come in, I don't control who uses what. I don't control the generator schedule. I don't control the water draw. I don't control the food rationing. I lose operational authority over a system I spent 3 years designing. You're describing a home, Craig. You're describing what happens when other people live in your home. I wanted to say something cutting. I wanted to say that a home and a survival shelter are not the same thing, that operational authority isn't ego, that someone has to make decisions, and it should be the person who built the system and understands its tolerances. I wanted to say all of this, and I wanted it to sound reasonable and righteous and correct. Instead, I said, I framed the invoice for the door. Janelle looked at me. I framed it and hung it in the entry corridor so everyone who came in would know what it cost. I need you to understand what kind of person does that. I know what kind of person does that, she said. I'm looking at him. Then why are you here? Because you also gave me the code, same person, same night. I opened the door on day 5. I want to be precise about why, because the why is the only part of this that matters. It wasn't because Janelle convinced me. It wasn't because the infected were getting closer. On day 4, 2 more groups had passed within camera range, and Dale Renton's team had gone quiet and tense in a way that suggested they understood they could not defend their position with 2 dome tents and a Honda generator. It wasn't because the seizure order was legal, which it might have been, or because I felt moral obligation, which I did not. I opened the door because the water pump on level 2 developed a vibration, a low cycling hum that I noticed at 3 a.m. on day 5 while lying awake in my chair on level 4. The pump was a Grundfos SQ Flex, rated for solar or battery operation, and it had been flawless during every test I'd run. But tests are not operations. A test is an hour. Operations is days, weeks, months, and somewhere in the sustained draw of continuous use, a bearing or an impeller or a seal had begun to protest. I went up to level 2 and opened the pump access panel. A 22 by 22 inch hatch I'd designed into the mechanical closet, and I looked at the unit with the flashlight I kept on a magnetic mount. I could hear the vibration. I could not identify the source. I had spent $3.8 million building this shelter, and I had not spent 60 hours learning to maintain it, because in my mind maintaining it was something I'd hire someone to do, and the idea that I might not be able to hire someone had never fully penetrated the part of my brain where real planning lives. I sat on the floor of my mechanical closet at 4 in the morning, next to a pump that cost $2,800, and I realized that my shelter was a portrait of a man who believed money was the same thing as competence. Janelle found me there an hour later. The pump sounds wrong, she said. I know? Do you know what's wrong with it? No. She sat down next to me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, Dale Renton told me on the intercom that one of his guard reservists was a plumber before he enlisted. Name is Victor Tran. I said nothing. Craig, your pump is going to fail. When it fails, you lose pressurized water on every level. Your hand pump backup draws from the same well, which means it works, but it means hauling water up 3 flights of stairs by hand. You designed this place for one man with 2 working arms. You didn't design it for failure. I designed it for everything. You designed it for everything you could buy. You didn't design it for anything you couldn't. Day 5, 8:17 a.m. I climbed the stairs to level 1. I walked through my decontamination corridor past the framed invoice for the blast door. I entered my code. I disengaged the bolts, and I opened the door. Dale Renton was standing 12 feet away, as though he'd been expecting this exact moment, which he probably had. I'm not surrendering the shelter, I said. I'm admitting a civilian with a mechanical skill set I require. One person, the plumber. His name is Victor Tran, Dale said. I don't care what his name is. He fixes the pump. He leaves. Dale nodded. He turned and spoke to a stocky man in guard fatigues who was already walking forward. Victor Tran was 34, built like a fire hydrant, with close-cropped black hair and grease-darkened hands that suggested he'd been trying to fix something on the OES trailer. He walked past me into the corridor, looked at the framed invoice and said, $212,000 for a door? My brother-in-law could have got you one for 90. I did not respond. I led him to level 2. I showed him the pump. He listened to it for about 30 seconds, asked me for a 10mm wrench, removed a single panel screw, and realigned the mounting bracket that had shifted during the initial pressurization sequence. The vibration stopped. Total repair time, 4 minutes. "Bracket wasn't torqued to spec during install," he said. "Your contractor cut a corner. Probably saved you $40. He looked around level 2. He looked at the kitchen, the pantry, the bunks, the air filtration display, the operations desk with its monitors. I watched his face perform the same calculation Janelle's had, measuring the gap between what this place cost and what it was actually worth. "There's a kid outside with a broken arm," he said. "I know about the kid. His mother's name is Carmen. She carried him 3 miles from Porterville." I said, "I know about the kid." Victor set the wrench on the counter. He didn't move towards the door. He stood in my kitchen, in my shelter, and he waited. I let Carmen and Marco in 20 minutes later. Not because Victor convinced me, not because Janelle convinced me, because the pump had already taught me the lesson. I could buy a shelter, but I couldn't maintain one alone. And every hour I spent pretending otherwise was an hour the shelter spent teaching me I was wrong. Carmen Herrera was 41. She was a home health aide who had been driving to a patient's house when the Porterville perimeter collapsed. Marco was her youngest son. He was 14, and he had not spoken a single word since the fracture, and his silence filled every room he entered in a way that made my $14,800 Garland range and my $22 per square foot oak floors feel exactly as hollow as they were. Dale Renton came inside on day 8. By then, the exterior camp had become untenable. The infected were moving through the foothills in loose clusters of 4 to 12 drawn. We thought, we guessed, nobody actually knew, by sound or heat or some residual navigational impulse that oriented them towards structures. Dale's team had survived a direct encounter on day 6, when a group of 7 came through the gate at dusk. The guard reservists discharged their weapons. 2 of the infected went down. 5 redirected east. But the sound drew a second group from the south, and by the time that encounter ended, Dale's team had used most of their ammunition, and one of the county workers had a bite on his forearm that everyone tried not to look at. His name was Phil Ostrander. He was 53, an equipment operator for the county road department, and when the bite was confirmed as a transmission vector. We knew this from the broadcasts, from the pattern, from the plain fact that Phil began running a fever within 6 hours. Dale made the decision to isolate him in one of the dome tents. Phil died on day 7. What happened after he died is something I watched on my cameras from level 4 and chose not to describe in my notebook. Dale pressed the intercom on the morning of day 8, and he didn't ask for entry. He didn't cite the seizure order. He said, "Craig, we can't stay out here." By then there were 17 people at the camp, the original 10 minus Phil, plus Carmen and Marco who were already inside, plus the 4 who'd arrived on day 3, plus 4 more who'd come in 1s and 2s from the direction of Porterville. My shelter was designed for 6. I was already at 5. Me, Janelle, Victor, Carmen, Marco. The math that Dale was proposing would put 20 people in a space designed for 6, and the math was exactly the calculation I'd built the shelter to make unnecessary. I could say no, the blast door would hold. The intercom was a one-way power dynamic. I could hear them, lecture them, dismiss them, and return to my chair 41 feet underground, where the temperature was 68 degrees, and the redbreast was still 3/4 full. And I wanted to say no. Not from cruelty. From the bone-deep conviction that I had built something precise, and precision cannot survive dilution. My generator had a fuel budget. My pantry had a caloric budget. My water system, now working thanks to Victor's 4-minute repair, had a draw rate. Every additional person was a deviation from the plan, and the plan was mine, and the plan was right, and the plan was all I had. Janelle didn't say anything this time. She was sitting at the operations desk on level 2, monitoring the cameras, and she simply turned the screen so I could see it. Dale Renton's people were standing near the blast door. Some of them were looking at the camera. Some were looking at the tree line. The teenager, the one from day 3, I later learned his name was Alejandro, was sitting on the ground with his back to the vehicle bay wall, eyes closed, arms wrapped around his knees. Victor was in the mechanical closet, pretending to check the pump. Carmen was holding Marco, who still hadn't spoken. I opened the door. They came in single file. Dale first, then his remaining OES staff, then the guard reservists, then the county workers, then the civilians. They moved through the decontamination corridor in a line that passed directly under the framed invoice for the blast door, and not one of them looked at it, which bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. I'd put it there so people would see it. Now people were seeing it, and it was invisible. The number didn't register because to people who'd spent a week sleeping in dome tents while the dead walked past their camp, $212,000 was a sound from another language. 21 people in a shelter designed for 6. The generator fuel budget dropped from 8 months to 11 weeks. The food supply dropped from 18 months too. I made Victor help me with this calculation. Approximately 53 days if rationed aggressively. The water could be managed, but the sewage system was a composting unit rated for 6 adults, and 21 adults would exceed its processing capacity within 2 weeks. At which point, level 1 would begin to smell like what it was, a hole in the ground full of too many people. I convened a meeting on level 2. I stood at the head of the table, my table, Douglas fir, $4,600 and I looked at 20 faces and I said, "This is my shelter. I built it. I paid for it. While you are inside it, I am the authority. My rules, my schedule, my resource allocation. If anyone has a problem with that, the door is right there." Dale Renton, who was leaning against the wall near the pantry, folded his arms and said nothing. Janelle, who was sitting at the far end of the table, looked at me the way she had on day 3. Measuring, pricing, and Victor, who was standing in the mechanical closet doorway with a wrench in his hand, my wrench, from my toolkit, $89 snap-on combination set, said quietly, "The door's also right there for you, Craig. Let me tell you how authority erodes. It doesn't collapse, it doesn't shatter, it erodes, the way a riverbank erodes, particle by particle, so slowly that you only notice when you look down and realize you're standing on air. For the first week after full occupation, my rules held. I controlled the generator schedule, 16 hours on, 8 hours off, shifted from my original plan to conserve fuel. I controlled meal preparation, 2 meals per day, measured portions, prepared by Carmen because she had the most experience feeding groups and because I designated her. I controlled access between levels. Level 4 was mine, locked with a code only I knew, non-negotiable. People followed these rules because they were afraid, and because the infrastructure worked, and because I spoke with the confidence of a man who owned everything around him. Confidence is a currency, and I'd been spending it my entire adult life. Day 12. Dale Renton approached me on level 2 with a printed copy of his seizure order, which he'd been carrying in a folder since day 1. "I want to discuss governance," he said. "There's nothing to discuss. This is private property." "Craig, the state government that issued this order may no longer exist in functional form, but the principle behind it, that critical infrastructure in a public emergency serves the public. That principle doesn't require a functioning state. It requires my consent." "Does it?" We were standing in the corridor between the kitchen and the operations desk. 20 feet away, Alejandro was sitting on a bunk, reading a novel he'd found in my level 3 storage. A Tom Clancy paperback I'd bought in an airport in 2019. $9.99. Around us, the shelter hummed. Generator, air system, pump. My systems. My sound. "Dale, let me explain something." You came here to take this shelter. Your order says the state of California can seize it. The state of California is gone. Your order is a piece of paper. I am the only authority in this building. Dale nodded slowly. And when the generator fuel runs out in 9 weeks, will you be the only authority who can manufacture diesel? That's my problem to solve. It's everyone's problem, Craig. That's what you keep missing. It stopped being yours the moment you opened the door. I didn't have an answer for that. Not because he was wrong, but because I knew, in the part of my brain where money couldn't reach, that he was right, and I hated him for it the way you hate a mechanic who tells you the transmission is shot when you just paid for new tires. Day 15. Victor Tran, without asking me, reconfigured the generator's fuel injection timing to improve efficiency. He estimated a 12% reduction in fuel consumption, which would extend our supply by 8 to 10 days. He did this because he knew how, and because the generator needed it, and because he did not consider the generator mine in any sense that mattered. I found him in the mechanical closet with the injector housing disassembled on a cloth. You don't touch the systems without my authorization, I said. Victor looked up at me. He was holding a fuel injector in his left hand, a cloth in his right, and he had the expression of a man deciding how much truth to spend. Craig, you don't know what a fuel injector does. I know what it costs. It costs nothing if the generator dies, and I'm trying to keep your shelter running. You can either help or you can go sit in your chair. There it was. The chair. My $6,400 chair on level 4, behind a locked door, at the bottom of my hole. The chair that I'd bought as a throne and that had become, in the mouths of the people I was sheltering, a symbol of everything useless about me. Day 18. The composting toilet on level 1 exceeded its capacity. The smell reached level 2. I had no contingency for this because my plan assumed 6 users, and even my money couldn't change the microbiology of decomposition. Dale organized a team to construct a secondary waste system using materials from level 3 storage, and he did this without consulting me. And when I protested, Janelle said, Craig, are you volunteering to redesign the sewage system? Because if you are, we'd love to hear your plan. I didn't have a plan. I had a receipt for the composting unit, $8,700, and the receipt was not going to process human waste for 21 people. Day 22. I went down to level 4 and I locked the door and I sat in my chair. The leather was warm. It held body heat. That was part of the custom design, thermal responsive foam, an additional $800 for the upholstery. And I looked at the 75-inch screen showing the exterior cameras, and I saw that my property was empty and quiet under a sky that looked the same as it always had. Somewhere above me, Victor was maintaining my generator. Carmen was rationing my food. Dale was governing my shelter. Janelle was coordinating my communications. And I was sitting in a $6,400 chair that did exactly what it was designed to do, which was hold one man in comfort while everyone else did the work. I sat there for 3 hours. I drank bourbon. I looked at the numbers in my notebook. Fuel remaining, food remaining, water draw rates. And I realized that I'd been keeping the ledger of a building that no longer recognized me as its owner. The numbers were mine. The building wasn't. It had been taken from me not by the government's seizure order, but by the simple fact that 20 other people needed it to function, and I could not make it function alone. $3.8 million buys a structure. It does not buy the competence to run one. The turning point arrived on day 26 in the form of absurdity. I was on level 2, sitting at the operations desk, which I still thought of as mine, though Dale and Janelle both used it more than I did, when the shortwave radio crackled to life on a frequency I hadn't monitored. Porterville Shelter, this is Task Force Sequoia, California National Guard, requesting facility status and occupant count. Do you copy? Dale reached the radio before I did. He keyed the mic and responded with his OES credentials, his badge number, the occupant count, and a concise status report that included fuel reserves, food supply, water condition, and medical situation. He delivered this information fluently, from memory, because he'd been tracking it on a clipboard he kept on level 2 while I'd been tracking it in a moleskin on level 4. Porterville Shelter, be advised, Task Force Sequoia is establishing a forward operating base at Camp Nelson. We have orders to consolidate all surviving civilian populations in Tulare County. A vehicle convoy will reach your position within 48 hours. Prepare for evacuation. Evacuation of my shelter. To a military base I'd never seen, run by people I'd never met, under an authority that might or might not represent a functioning government. Dale looked at me. They're coming, Craig. I heard. They'll want the shelter. They'll want to take it from me, you mean? They'll want to use it. Same as we're using it. I went down to level 4. I locked the door. And then I did something I hadn't done in 26 days. I called my daughter. Not on a phone. The cell networks were dead. I sat in my chair and I spoke out loud to a woman who was 2 states away and who I had not thought about, honestly and specifically, since I'd driven to this shelter on day 1. Emily, I said to the room, your father built a $4 million hole in the ground, and it turns out the hole is the most accurate portrait of me ever made. It's expensive, and it's deep, and it's exactly the right temperature, and nobody wants to be in it. I laughed. It was not a good laugh. Your mother was right. The shelter wasn't preparation, it was architecture. I built what I am, a man who measures everything and maintains nothing, a man who thinks paying for something is the same as deserving it. The cameras showed the empty hilltop, the scrub oaks, the gravel road I'd resurfaced for $34,000. I think the worst thing I've learned down here is that I'm not angry they took it from me. I'm angry it was so easy. I thought ownership was structural. I thought if you poured enough concrete and hung enough invoices, the building was yours the way a body is yours. But it turns out a building belongs to whoever keeps it running, and the person who keeps this one running is a plumber from Sacramento who charges less per hour than my chair cost per square inch. The air system cycled. The hum was steady. Victor's work. I'm going to let them take it, Em. Not because I'm generous, because I'm tired of being the man in the chair. I climbed the stairs. All 4 flights. Level 4 to level 3 to level 2 to level 1. Past the pantry that Carmen had reorganized. Past the operations desk where Dale's clipboard sat. Past the mechanical closet where Victor's tools were arranged on a shelf he'd built from level 3 lumber. Past the decontamination corridor where 21 pairs of shoes were lined up against the wall in a system Janelle had implemented, because I'd never thought about where people would put their shoes. I stopped at the framed invoice. $212,000. The blast door, my door, the first number I'd wanted every person to see. I took it off the wall. The nail left a small hole in the concrete. A masonry anchor, 40 cents. I held the frame in my hands, and I looked at the number, and I felt the weight of a piece of paper that had once been a monument and was now a souvenir. I put it face down on the floor. I leaned it against the wall like a painting in an attic, waiting for nobody. The convoy arrived on day 28. 3 Humvees and a 5-ton truck, National Guard markings, Task Force Sequoia patches on the shoulders of soldiers who looked young and tired and professionally functional in a way that reminded me of my roofers on a long job. Not inspired, not heroic, just working. Their commanding officer was a captain named Reyes. She was maybe 35, compact, with a voice that carried the flat authority of someone who had been making decisions without sleep for weeks. She walked through the blast door, looked at the decontamination corridor, looked at the operations level, and said, "Who's in charge of this facility?" Dale looked at me. Janelle looked at me. Victor, standing in the mechanical closet doorway, looked at me. "Nobody," I said. It runs itself. Captain Reyes looked at me the way people in authority look at people who have recently stopped being in authority, with a brief, measuring patience. Somebody built it. I did. Then you're the point of contact for facility systems. I can show you the receipts. If you want to know how anything actually works, talk to the plumber. Reyes blinked. Then she turned to Dale and began the evacuation briefing. Camp Nelson was 17 miles east, at an elevation of 4,800 feet, in a former Forest Service camp that the guard had hardened with Jersey barriers and concertina wire. Population was approximately 300, mostly civilians from the Porterville and Springville areas. They had medical staff, water, generator power, and a helicopter landing zone for resupply. We would leave in 2 hours. We could take personal items. The shelter would be locked and logged as a government asset for potential future use. Government asset. There it was. The seizure. Completed. Not with the piece of paper Dale had taped to the door on day 3, but with a captain's clipboard and a logistical notation. My shelter reassigned. My 40 acres requisitioned. My $3.8 million absorbed into an infrastructure that would never know my name or care about the invoice I'd had framed. I should have been furious. 3 years of planning, 14 months of construction. Every dollar I'd made putting thermoplastic polyolefin on the roofs of the Central Valley, converted into a concrete structure that a 35-year-old captain was now logging as a line item. Instead, I went down to level 4 for the last time. I sat in the chair. I ran my hand along the armrest. The leather was worn now, slightly, where my right arm had rested during 28 days of sitting and watching and losing. I opened my notebook to the first page, where I'd written, "They want my shelter. They can't have it," underlined twice. I tore the page out. I folded it twice and put it in my wallet, next to the original construction receipt. 2 pieces of paper, one documenting what I'd spent, one documenting what I'd believed, both equally worthless now, and I kept them for the same reason, because the man who wrote them deserved to be remembered accurately. Then I went to the biometric panel on level 1. The shelter's access system was keyed to my thumbprint and a 16-digit code. The code I'd given to Janelle in a hotel room in Cambria. The code that had started all of this, not the outbreak, not the seizure, but the cracking open, the first breach, the first admission that a shelter for one was a tomb. I opened the admin menu. I selected Reset All Access Credentials. The system asked for confirmation. I pressed Yes. The panel went dark, then rebooted to factory default. No thumbprint, no code. The door would now open with a 4-digit PIN that I set to 0000. Victor was standing behind me. "You just wiped the security?" I set the PIN to 4 zeros. "That's not security." "No, it isn't." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Your contractor also overtalked the hinge bolts on the blast door. I fixed them on day 15. Didn't mention it because I figured you'd ask me how much the bolts cost." "How much did they cost?" "About $6. $6. Yeah, the things that actually keep it working are cheap, Craig. It's the things that make it look impressive that cost money." We walked out together, all 21 of us, through the decontamination corridor, past the blank wall where the invoice had hung, through the blast door that now answered to anyone. The sunlight hit my face for the first time in 28 days, and it was warm and sharp, and it smelled like dry grass and diesel exhaust from the Humvees, and I realized I had no idea what sunlight cost, because it was the one thing I'd never been able to purchase. Janelle walked beside me. She didn't take my hand. She didn't say anything affirming or redemptive or kind. She said, "You should drink some water, you look dehydrated." She was right, I was. I drank water from a military canteen offered by a soldier whose name I didn't know, and it tasted like plastic and chlorine, and it was the best water I'd ever had because it wasn't mine. We loaded into the trucks. The convoy pulled out. I sat in the bed of the 5-ton with 16 other civilians, and as we drove east on the gravel road, my road, $34,000, now just a road, I watched the shelter's camouflaged vehicle bay shrink in the distance until it looked like what it was supposed to look like from the air, a hay barn, a nothing, a structure that could be anything or belong to anyone. I still have the receipt in my wallet, $3,814,226.11. I keep it because it's the most expensive lesson I've ever been taught, and the lesson is this: you can buy the concrete. You can buy the door. You can buy the chair and the whiskey and the white oak floors. But the moment the first person walks in who isn't you, the building stops being a thing you own and starts being a thing you owe. And the interest on that debt is everything you thought the money was for. I owe Victor 4 minutes of pump repair that saved my water system. I owe Carmen 100 meals she cooked on a range she never asked the price of. I owe Dale the governance he built while I sat in a leather chair and counted what I'd lost. I owe Janelle one honest sentence spoken in a hotel room that cracked the whole thing open. I owe Marco his silence. I never found out why he stopped talking, but he sat on level 2 for 23 days, and he watched every person in that shelter, and he saw what I couldn't see from level 4, that the building worked because people made it work, not because someone paid for it. At Camp Nelson, Captain Reyes assigned me to the sanitation crew. I dug latrines for 300 people with a shovel someone handed me. The shovel was government issue, olive drab, probably cost $40. I used it for 9 hours a day. My hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Nobody asked me what I used to do. Nobody asked me how much money I had. Nobody asked me about the shelter. I was a man with a shovel, maintaining a system I didn't own, and it was the first time since I broke ground on that hole in Porterville that I felt like I was building something that wouldn't need my name on it to stand. I wrote this story because I couldn't stop thinking about the difference between building something and being worthy of it. We live in a time when preparedness has become a consumer category. You can buy a bunker, you can buy a year's worth of freeze-dried meals. You can buy a blast door and a generator and a water system and a custom leather chair, and you can sit in that chair and believe honestly that you have purchased survival. But survival isn't a product, it's a relationship. It requires other people, and other people require you to be something more than a customer. Craig's story is about a man who confused spending with building. He poured money into a hole in the ground and called it preparation. And then he discovered that the most critical system in any shelter is the one between people. The willingness to let someone else touch the generator, reorganize the pantry, change the rules. That system doesn't have a price tag, and you can't install it from a catalog. The real-world truth beneath this fiction is simple. In every disaster, the people who survive longest are not the ones with the most resources. They're the ones who can tolerate sharing them. 3 questions I'd like to leave with you. First, the practical one. Craig's shelter was designed for 6 people and ended up holding 21. At what point does expanding beyond a structure's designed capacity become genuinely reckless rather than generous? Where would you have drawn the line? Second, the moral one. Was Dale Renton right to push for shared governance, or did Craig have a legitimate claim to authority over a facility he built and paid for? Does ownership survive an apocalypse, or does emergency erase it? Third, the personal one. What have you built or accumulated in your life that you believe is yours? Truly, structurally yours. And what would it take for you to discover that it only works when you stop holding it so tightly? Thank you for listening. Everything I've built here belongs to you now,